Okay, so thanks for having me. So welcome to my talk on fantasy football data. Hopefully at the end, you'll see that FPL is a data game more than a football game. But who am I? So I'm a data engineer who's worked across many different sectors, including finance, manufacturing, real estate, basically anything which has got loads of data. And this is what's drawn me into the wonderful world of sort of like fantasy football, is the actual data that you can collect and analyze. And over the course of this presentation, hopefully you will see that the data that you can collect and analyze is really rich and really deep. But what is FPL? It's one of those games where people either know it or they don't. And by that, the community for fantasy football is growing. So as we can see, the chart on the left is actually showing how many players were sort of like playing many years ago. It skews the date format because I've just noticed that's wrong. But currently, last year, there was over 11.4 million players. And when you go back to 2002, there was literally just a handful of players. And we are talking literally 20,000, sorry. Now, this is worldwide managers. Now, fantasy football is a game where you get a budget and you got to pick your squad. So you got to pick your subs, you got to pick your starting 11, you get to pick your formation. There's different rules that you've got. One of the key parts is how you spend your budget. And this is where the data really comes into its own. And again, through the course of this, you will see how analyzing the data can work for you. But when I first started this, what was I actually doing? I was actually looking to see if there was a magic number with the data that I can actually plug in and see if it can actually help me predict. Because when I started work on this, it was actually a prediction website, but I got into fantasy football based on the fact of the variables that you needed to look at for teams to see whether they was going to win or lose. Now, is there a magic number for pi? Well, obviously not, because I'm still working. And it's one of those that I still believe there is something in there, but I just haven't found it yet. But what can the stats tell us about the football? Now, anyone that follows football knows home form is always better than away form. But is that a general rule, or does that count for sort of like certain teams? And again, looking at the data, that will tell you. Newly promoted teams. Now, this is really, really interesting because when you look at the season, which in the Premiership is 38 games, you could take out certain amount of games, and I generally say a rule of thumb: the first six and the last six, because that's the times when different things happen. So they're almost like the outliers, but you can actually use that to your advantage, because in the first six games of the season, what generally happens is established clubs and the clubs that have just been promoted are closer because match fitness, teams not fully understanding how a team plays. So again, it's actually looking at this data can actually help me. Now, when you're collecting this data, you're analyzing this data, you're looking at this data, this is a lot of work. So is it really worth it? Now, FPL is just one of many sports in fantasy sports. Now, these are the figures which I got off the internet quite recently. Currently, fantasy sports globally is worth almost 27 billion US dollars, and they reckon that's gonna grow to over 50 billion by 2028 in 5 years. Now, lockdown did really help, but when you look at this covers all the types of sports: basketball, NFL, NHL, cricket, literally many sports. Most sports have a fantasy equivalent. Now, the American market is the biggest, which you would expect, but the biggest growing market is the Asia Pacific. So when you're looking at this, it can be worth it. Now, it does depend on where you want to be. Now, for me, I've been doing the football analysis for over 20 years. I still work for a living, so I've never really had any sort of like a real big urge to create this a super AI and then sell it. But some people do. And that's why I said when I started doing this, it was a prediction tool. What I was trying to do was see if I could predict football games, as in win, lose, or draw. Could I predict accumulators? But it was one of those, betting is not my thing, so I sort of like pushed it to one side. But if we go back to FPL, like I said at the beginning, we're basically creating a squad of 15 players. Some of those players play, some of those players don't, because you've got a bench. But how do you get the points? So points are awarded for things like goals and assists, how many saves a goalie makes, clean sheets for defenders and keepers, and minutes played. In fantasy football, there's this golden 60th minute where you always want your players to reach 60 minutes, because then they get a bonus point for reaching that. Now, it could be they play the first 60, the last 60, as long as they play 60. But as well as gaining points, you also get points deducted. Goals conceded for goalkeepers and defenders, red and yellow cards, penalty misses. Now, when you're looking at the data, you will sort of like start to see patterns to say, I want this player because he takes penalties, but if he misses a penalty, it actually has the reverse. Now, and one of my slides actually go into how choosing a penalty taker is not always the best thing. And then you get the bonus points. Now, the bonus points are given for the best 3 players in a game, and it's a bit of a black box on how they award those points, but it's when they've done something really big in a game, or if it's a striker and he's missed a really big chance, he gets deducted these magical numbers that then goes towards the bonus points. Because at the end of the day, what you're trying to do is accumulate the most points over the 38 game week season. And also with FPL, you can create your own mini leagues, and so you're playing against other sort of like players within sort of like a work league, for argument's sake. Now, on top of the basic points, there's the captain. The captain gets twice as many points as what he would generally do. So if he gets 10, he gets 20. If he gets 20, he gets 40. That can be really, really key. And the last season, it was massive because of Mr. Haaland, who was again a set and forget captain. Now, you do have chips, a bit like jokers, where you can have 2 wild cards in a season, one before Christmas, one after. And this gives you the ability to change your team completely, fitting in with the money that you're allowed to spend and also the other rules. There's plenty of rules in FPL. I won't go through them all because that's not what this is about. And then you get the triple captain. So you can play now, these are one-time only chips that you could play. The triple captain is where they're worth 3 times as many points. So if he gets 10, he gets 30. Now, the one I didn't talk about was the free hit. The free hit is like similar to a wild card where you can play your entire team, but after that 1 week, it reverts back. Now, why does that matter? When you're looking at the data, you're not only looking at how well a player plays, you're looking at games, because there's a couple of things in fantasy football called like blank game weeks, double game weeks. A blank game week is where a team doesn't play, which means you won't get any points for players from that team. Double game week means they play more than 1 game. There has been one season with a triple game week, which was a really good season if you had actually picked that player. Now, when I say the 60 minutes, 60 minutes is why they came up with 60 minutes, I'm not sure. But let's just say you had a defender that played for 60 minutes and the game was 0-0. When he was substituted off, he would get points for the clean sheets, any other bonus points that he got, plus the points for playing 60 minutes. Now, if that team then concedes, it doesn't matter, because at the point he came off, it was still 0-0. So there's lots of little sort of like intricacies with the game that you need to understand. And this is why playing with the data is very, very important. Now, you could look at all the data in the world, you can analyze all the data in the world, but there's certain things that can still scupper you. Now, a couple of years ago, Liverpool had 21 clean sheets. So the community says you must have Liverpool defensive assets because you get bonus points for clean sheets. Last season, it went down to 14. So they're very expensive because the players of value goes up and down, and they're set at the start of the season, and they're set based on the previous season. So having an expensive asset can be not very good. So Liverpool assets weren't great. And then another thing that can scuff you is when you see a new player, because generally new players to the Premiership take time to settle. Mr. Haaland, once again, he broke that rule last year because he got 15 goals in the first 10 games. This included 3 hat tricks. Now, my next slide is going to tell you why things like this could really scuff you. But before I move on to my next slide, the thing is with the clean sheets, with the Liverpool assets, when you look at the data, you may choose a Liverpool player, not so much for their clean sheets, but for their goals and assists, because goals and assists are worth points as well. So again, looking at the data, you look at the rules, and that's how you would determine how you're going to pick your team. Now, one of the biggest errors, most football fans, and I'm a big football fan, I'm a big Liverpool fan, I have a habit of, yes, I look at the data, yes, I know that I should believe in the data, no, I don't always believe in the data. So last season just gone, I was having a conversation with a friend before the season started, and I said, with Haaland, if he scores 1, he's going to get more because there was a pattern. But I didn't think he would come into the Premiership and do so well. So even though the data was telling me to go with Haaland because I was looking at data from previous seasons, not in the Premiership, but I was still looking at data, I decided to pick Salah. Salah didn't have a great start to the season. So this is again where being a football fan doesn't mean you're going to be good at FPL. In fact, being a football fan can harm you because you bring emotions into it. So when you're looking at data, your head should rule your heart, but it doesn't always do that. I keep talking about data, but what sort of data are we looking at? So we collecting data from FPL APIs. I do a Power BI demo, by the way, so I'm not just going to talk through slides. But when you're looking at the data, you need to look at things like squad sizes. Squad sizes, big squads mean rotations. Rotated players don't score goals. On the other hand, small squads mean that players play more, so they get injured. If someone's injured, they don't score goals. There's a famous saying with fantasy football, which is Pep Roulette, referring to Pep Guardiola for Man City. Wow, that was a slip of the tongue. I almost said Pep Guardiola for Man United. But he has a habit of rotating his players quite a lot. Then the team success. The more success a team has means it has more games. More games mean they will rotate more. Midweek games, this is where the success comes into it, because if they're playing on a Wednesday or Thursday, will they play those players on a Saturday or Sunday? Depends on what they've got. And then players in international breaks. Why that's important is that if players don't play at international level, they get a longer rest. So that could be good. Now, when you're looking at all this, you're looking at data from outside of FPL at this point, but you're looking at that data to see what the chances are of your players are going to be picked. And then new manager bounce. Does this exist? This is a great one. This is one I thoroughly believe in. When a team does really bad and they sack a manager for the next 3 or 4 games, and I have done some analysis on this, but I haven't got the analysis to show you, you find that the new manager will raise the players for the next 3 or 4 games so they do well. Palace, they sack Vieira, they bring in a new manager, the next few games they win. And that happens more often than not. Not 100% of the time, but more often than not. One team that didn't happen with is Chelsea, because they sacked Potter because they were doing rubbish. They bring in Lampard and they were still doing rubbish. So again, when you're looking at the data, it's really interesting to see when you need to pick the players. And then the weather. I used to collect the weather data to compare it with the game kickoff times to actually see if that mattered. Because when a player comes from a foreign league, they're saying, can he play on a miserable Tuesday night in Blackburn? This was when Blackburn were in the Premiership. There was some statistical analysis done where it actually showed you that sometimes they couldn't, so they wouldn't play so well. So if you invest in a player for your FPL team, there could be a case of certain times throughout the season he won't be playing very good, i.e. A couple of months either side of December. And then sentiment analysis. This is a really good one. If you do FPL, the chances are you will follow accounts on Twitter. And social media is a hive of activity for who to pick. In fact, lots of people pick their teams not by doing data analysis, but by listening to what others are doing. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. The problem that creates for managers that do their own analysis is the fact that you end up with template teams, as they call them, where the same team has the same players. If you fall behind, it's then very difficult to catch up. And this is what happened with me this season, because I didn't have Haaland until later on, and it really scuppered me. So looking at all this data, you then get to the point where you start picking your players, you start saying who's going to be in your starting 11 this game week and who is your captain. Now, what makes a good captain? Now, I'm showing you this slide because when I'm looking at the data, there's different things that people look at. Some do form over fixtures, some do a thing called XG and XA, which is expected goals and expected assists. Now, in this particular game week, this was game week 26 and game week 27. So this was March. Now, I was looking at what players I had against which fixtures they had. So on the game week 26, Liverpool had Man United, and then the following week they had Bournemouth. So me, in my infinite wisdom, I looked at it and thought, I'm going to show you another slide in a minute, which actually shows you why I made the decision, which I'm just about to tell you I made. I decided to not have Salah in 26 because I didn't think Liverpool were going to put 7 past Man United. Now, I didn't even think they would get a win, but there was another piece of data which I didn't look at, which would have told me they would. So what happened in game week 26? I put Haaland as captain. Didn't have Salah in my team. Haaland gets 4 points, which means he got 8 points as a captain. Salah gets 21, which means he would have got 42 points. That's a big captain score. I panicked the following week and brought in Salah against Bournemouth. Bournemouth beat Liverpool 1-0. Salah misses a penalty. Now, this is what I was referring to earlier about the penalty taker. So Salah gets a grand total of 0 because he got 2 points for playing more than 60, -2 for getting a penalty miss. Now, the piece of data which I should have looked at is, as you can see, there's a green box around Liverpool here. Now, what this is doing is win percent, as in home and away. Dark blue being away, home being light blue. So if we look at it, Liverpool's away form this year was atrocious. Their home form was good. It was one of the best in the league after the likes of Arsenal and Man City. So the win against United should have been expected, maybe not 7 goals. The defeat against Bournemouth should have been expected. But the reason why I chose Salah against Bournemouth is because they had a very good game earlier in the season. So this was one of those times when I looked at the data, didn't look at all the data, I cherry picked the data, and it really backfired on me. So when I do the Power BI demo, this is one of the reports that actually made me make this selection. This is the former players. I won't go through everything on this because I'll show you in the demo. But what this is doing is this is looking at game week 25. The red means there's a blank game week. So basically, there is a color code. If it's just a normal back color, that means it's just got 4 games because I'm looking at 4 games at a time. It's a rolling 4-game total. Red means there's a blank. There's a dark green, which means there's an additional game as well, because sometimes you get the double game week. So when I looked at all the facts, Liverpool had United, they had a blank game week. It wasn't worth bringing him in, but because I lost so many points, I decided to actually go for him, and it really didn't pay off. Now, just a quick picture of how I actually collect all my data. So how do I collect the data? So I basically got I've got a server which just runs every 15 minutes, 24/7 during the season. There is a reason why I do it every 15 minutes. And again, when I go through the demo, I would explain why. So it goes to FPL API. It goes to the FPL website, uses the API and brings down a file every 15 minutes. That goes into a file store. On a weekly basis, I go to another FPL API and I capture a aggregated version of all the data. And then also I take weekly files from other APIs to do with other data. And then these processes just run in the background. And then I run some additional processes which runs the data when they need to be run. So the daily, when I pull in the 15-minute files, they get processed and then they go through to the database, they get transformed. All the data gets amalgamated into a data model and then it gets fed out to Power BI. Then on the aggregated data, the same. So this is basically allowing me to capture data, and it's 15 minutes because I capture transfer data. Now, one of the things which I haven't mentioned yet is player values go up based on how popular they are. With FPL, a more popular a player is, it's the harder it is to use that player to make up points, but it means his price is likely to go up. But I will show you that when I go through the demo. So this is sort of like how I collect the data, and it's just nicely working in the background. At the moment, it's all switched off because the season's over. So at this point, I'd like to just do a Power BI demo. So what do I do with the data? So hopefully you can see a Power BI dashboard. So what this dashboard is showing is the top left-hand chart is showing you that chart which I looked at for the why I didn't pick Salah. So this just gets updated on a weekly basis because this data comes from an API that gets updated weekly. All the rest gets updated as and when the data comes in. So you get XG and XA. XG is expected goals, XA is expected assists. The higher the number, the more likely they are to get assists and goals. That's important because goals and assists are key for playing FPL. You've just got goals scored, and then you've got the bonuses. As I said, bonuses are key because that's additional points. When we look at midfield, they're quite close, but if I was to click on defender, what will happen is we can see that there's a massive difference between Trippier and Alexander over the course of the season. Now, this is most of the dashboards you're going to see are based on season wide because the season's over, but there is a couple where I've manipulated the data to make it more interesting. So what this just does is this gives me a landing page where I can just look at the data, and it's supposed to bring stuff to life. Now, at this point, before I move any further forward, what I will actually say is, as you can see, there's probably about 10 different reports I use. This used to be about 25 to 30 reports. So I was doing it like I was a business analyst. And so basically I was looking at all these charts. Over the years, I've cut down the charts. And again, these will be cut down. The goal is to get to a place where I've got a single dashboard where I can look and then it tells me what I need to do. Slightly different than AI, but along that same line, but I'm not quite there yet. So this chart is quite good because it gives me an overview, and it gives me an overview based on the positions. Now, the selected chart. Now, this is the one where I was saying about the transfer. So what we've got here, we've just got all the different teams along the top, and I got it by position. So this just gives me the team name where the player belongs to, the player name. I've got a rank overall and a rank position. Now, rank overall is basically just it's just giving you, if you put all the players together, and it's basing it off total points. Rank position is based on the rank in that position based on the total points. Now, selected is just the percentage of teams that have got them. So in this particular one, Haaland he finished the season with 78.4. Now, interestingly, Jesus from Arsenal he went up really quickly. He was the first player to hit 80% ownership before he got injured, and then he went down. Now, why is ownership important? Because what happens is someone like Haaland, if everyone has Haaland and Haaland does very well, it's very difficult to make up points on any of your rivals because the chances are they've got them. So what I try and do, use this report to see is if there's a player that I could swap him for certain games to see if I can gain on my rival. Now, if you play FPL, generally people play it two different ways. The first way is when they're very good at it and they lead from the start, so they play a cautious game. I have a habit of not doing very well at the start. I'm an abysmal player at the start of the season. And that's because I use the data, and at the start of the season, there is no data. And so I always end up playing catch up. Player value. Player value is 12.4. 124 means 12.4 million, but I didn't want to use decimals. Then we've got total points, minutes played, goals scored, assist, and then the cards. So as you can see, because you get points deducted for cards, I include those on a lot of reports. But all this is doing is giving me an oversight over what players are sort of like doing well and which players aren't. Now, the player form one is the one I said earlier. This is the one that gets used most of the time. So this was the infamous game week 25. But if I go to sort of like something like 35, you can start to see where there is different colors, but as you get later on into the season, it's not as meaningful. But what it does is it gives me player, value, position, the next 4 games. Now, the next 4 games, again, when I said earlier, form over fixtures, this just gives me an indication of whether I should go for someone. Total points is based for total points over those 4 games, and this is the breakdown. Now, the breakdown can be really key because you can have someone high up in the form table, but if they got like 30 points in a single game, they will be really high. So what you can actually do is you can start looking at this to discount players for when you're actually going to pick them. And then you just got goals scored and assists. Now, when I'm looking at my data for FPL, I mainly look at goal scores and assists. I always look at clean sheets as a massive bonus. So I generally, even when I picked like people, the Liverpool assets, I was choosing them for their attacking returns as opposed to their defensive returns. So with Trent and Robbo, so Trent Alexander-Arnold and Andy Robertson, they would get a lot of assists and the occasional goal. So even though they didn't get a clean sheet, they would get some good returns. So again, the point when you're playing FPL is the players are banded in price, but each player has a price, but you can almost band them to be premium and non-premium. And when you're picking your teams, you're looking at the return on investment, and that's a chart I will show right at the end. Is like a return on investment chart, which I'm currently working on. So this is the one I use most of the time. And this is the reason why I'm atrocious at the start of the season, because you want at least 4 or 5 games before you can really start to get some form. I'm the sort of person that when Bastian Schweinsteiger joined for United as a defensive midfielder, I decided to pick him because he was a big name and he did absolutely nothing. So even though I've got all the data, sometimes I make some real stupid decisions. Hence why I'm a second half player as opposed to a first half. So this is the one I use all the time. So the player dashboard, as I call it, they're all dashboards, but with this one, if I choose my bookmark, this is the one where I use when I want to compare players. So basically on the selected, that gives you a point in time, which is generally the latest point in time of what they're doing. So if we look here, so this tells me the ownership. Ownership is good. A low ownership player who scores goals is much better than a high ownership player. Not having a high ownership player though can be costly. So as you can see, with this is Jesus, 82%, so ownership. So he was owned by more than 80% before anyone else. And see, I wasn't the only one that didn't think Haaland would do well, but a lot of people did get him before. I should have looked at this and realized, but as I was saying, you can have all the data in the world, but if you look at the data and you bring emotions into it, you don't do very well. And then you can clearly see that he dropped off and the prices were reflective of it. Now, if you look here, I bring the all the like value, points, goal scored, assists, clean sheets, yellow cards, and red cards. But on this one, I've just got the weekly points as well. And then you can clearly see where you got a load of zeros, and this was where Jesus got injured and he wasn't playing. So again, a lot of these dashboards they will be amalgamated, so I get less and less, but the dashboards are telling me more and more. So a lot of people that play FPL, it's sort of like one player that they always like to go for is Harry Kane. So if we bring Harry Kane in, and then we look at him against the others, we can clearly see that sort of like Kane's ownership, it's not massive. It started at 90 and ended in at 33%. His price actually dipped, and the dip was because he was getting rid of more. Now, Harry Kane's a really interesting player. And by that, I mean, if you look at the start of Haaland, and if you look at the sort of like Haaland was getting, he was sort of like getting hat tricks and he was scoring lots of points. If you look at Kane, he was still scoring well, but it was consistent. But when you look at the end, it was a lot more consistent. So when you look at how well someone like Kane did against Haaland with the price difference, the fact is Kane only finished 9 points behind Haaland, but it was because Haaland did a lot of damage in the early part of the season. So having Kane wouldn't have been too bad. Now, when I mentioned earlier about the set and forget captains, what some people do is they will just set Haaland as captain and never change that. So they would have got 272. So their captain would have got 544 over the whole season. Even if you would have done Kane, it would have been a lot less. But what you're trying to do is you would do like Haaland and then Kane, didn't matter, Haaland, Kane. And so what you're trying to do is you're almost trying to look for patterns to see when to pick your players as captains. Now, it's a lot easier to do it once you've got the data and it's already happened. But what you're trying to do is look to see if there's some type of pattern that occurs, to see if a player scores against a certain team all the time. So by using this data, you can actually look for patterns. So this is another one I use quite a lot, and it's quite interesting because I use this to see what people are thinking. Now, this will get updated every 15 minutes based on the data that comes in, because what will happen is I run the data that comes, the API that runs for 15 minutes, bring back the data. A lot of the data is static, but the transfer data changes every 15 minutes, so I can bring that in. Now, the player cost, that changes just after midnight every day. So what will happen is you can start, if you've got the 15-minute data, you can start to see if you can predict a price rise. Extremely difficult, it really, really is. But you can start to see if a player is becoming very popular. And if a player is becoming very popular, then you may want to say, right, okay, I'll get him just before, you wouldn't stay up and get him, but you would say, I'm going to get him because he's on the way up, so he might have a price rise tonight. And that's where Twitter comes into it, because Twitter does sort of like say, oh, we think we're going to have a price rise tonight. So the actual social media community is really good. Now, when you're talking of 0.1 increases in value or 0.1 decreases in value, that can mean a lot. And this is why you can miss out on getting a player by not having enough funds because he went up by 0.1. Now, the other thing that's really interesting is when you look at players, their starting price and their ending price. Now, when you sell a player, you only get half of the price that increased while you had it. So if you had a player and he went from 10 million to 11 million, if you sold him, you'd only get 10.5. So when you're looking at your team value, again, you need to look at it to see, well, if I sell him to get someone else, will I be able to buy him back? So again, there's lots of inner strategies with FPL. And this is why I'm saying FPL is more of a data game than a football game. But I do say it because I like to try and get as many people involved in this. And it's surprising how many people are not football fans. So this chart, I really, really use a lot. Now, going back to when I said about seeing if there's patterns. Right, now, this is a bit of a messy chart. I get that. I find it quite useful. The top is the team points. The bottom one is points scored against. So if I click on Bournemouth, game week 4, oh, look at that. Liverpool got 117 points against Bournemouth. That is why I chose him in 26 or whenever it was, Salah, to be captain, without looking at the home and away form. This was a home game. And actually in this one, if you look, we got to go quite far down. Salah only got 3 points in that game anyway. So he didn't do well against Bournemouth. It was the likes of these players that did well against Bournemouth. So I chose him for all the wrong reasons. And it was a knee-jerk reaction because he got so many points against United. So for me, having all the data, I should have looked closer. And if we look sort of like here, I think it's this one, we can see, there we go. These are all the players, no player. Oh, look, here's Salah. Yeah, there's Salah with 0 points. No Liverpool. I think no Liverpool player got above 2 points that game. But if we look here, we got Liverpool with 107. But then you say, oh, Everton, they conceded 162 in game week 25. But this is because they had a double game week. So this is where, when you're looking at these, you can say, oh, if Everton had, when you're looking at Everton as an opposition, you can say, oh, look, they're really conceding lots of good points. But when you look at this, they conceded 1972 against 2 different teams in that same game week. So again, when you look at this, this is just an indicator of where to look. It doesn't actually, it tells you enough to look in places, but it doesn't sort of like give you the answer what you want. And that's the thing with all this analyzing the data. It points you in the direction of where you need to go, but it doesn't actually give you all the answers. It gives you a group of players that you need to look at. Then it's down to you to figure out why you want to choose A over B. If we take that one step further and we look at the player stats, I take forwards out. If we look here, again, with a lot of these reports, what I'm doing, so this is all based on the same data and the same data model, but I'm displaying it at different levels. So this, I'm going down more into the actual player level. But what I will be doing is sort of like picking out the best and just coming out with a single dashboard, so like I can sort of like start to hone in on who I should have. So like Bournemouth, they've conceded more points than anyone else last season. So again, when I look at the why did I pick Salah, there was reasons why I picked Salah. But if I would have looked at certain bits of other data and added those data points together, I wouldn't have done it. But I didn't look at all those data, and this is the emotions came into it. Salah got 21 points against United, 0 against Bournemouth. But there was, reasons on why I shouldn't have done it, but there was reasons on why I did do it, and I just have to learn from that. And so when you look at that, you can see the most points. So there you go, Liverpool, 117 points. So Liverpool got more points against Bournemouth than any other team against anyone else. And when we look at that, this is just a goal scored. Again, they just give me sort of like patterns. So as we can see here, the Haaland versus Harry Kane. And it's interesting with the sort of like Ivan Toney as well. But then he missed some games, and we all know why he missed some games. What this does is this just allows me to see patterns. And if I can see patterns, then hopefully I can use those patterns to actually help me better. Now, the interesting thing with this is like with Firmino, he got 22 points in game week 4 against Bournemouth. Firmino was very good at the start of the season. A lot of Liverpool players were poor. So again, if you look at the data, he would be a player which you would say, actually, he's doing okay. But it's trying to use the data to get the players when they're on their sort of like their rich striker form, which is not always easy. And then I just want to go back to the player form. Right, so now if I right click on Salah, and then I do the player dashboard. what this basically does is this is when I'm starting to build out dashboards to sort of show me more. So what I can actually do on this, I can see we're looking at data from the end of the season. So it doesn't look as good as when it's mid-season, because then there will be differences. I've got player ownership, I've got player costs, minutes played, total minutes played. He did 3,290. The most for a midfielder was 3,379. He had the most points for a midfielder. He had the most goals for a midfielder. He didn't have the most assists and he didn't have the most clean sheets. I just happen to know who did have the most assists. So if I look at Man City, and then I do De Bruyne, and then do player dashboard. De Bruyne had the most assists, and we can actually see his ownership curve against his player cost curve. This shows it really well, as when a player is more owned, his cost goes up. So again, when you're looking at this is getting closer to where I want to be. So actually with the form, I use this one. I just wanted to show this later in the presentation. But what it gives me is it gives me an idea of who's doing what. Now, if I go, I use Salah again. Sorry, I keep using Liverpool players. But if I do a point in time, this is again is another one that I look at. Now, this is the one where I've manipulated the data. So what this basically does is the point in time. So if this is sort of like game week 32 or something, which I stop the data. So basically what happens, this gives me the total scores for the season. And if you're in X week, this will tell you what points they had at exactly the same point in previous seasons. Now, why is that important? Because like here, at this time he had 166, which was his lowest score. But if you look at it, like in 1920, season 1920, he got 186, and he only got an additional, less than 50 points. This season, he got an additional, 80 points. So he had a better finish to the season. So again, when you're looking at stuff, it's what you're making your decision to say, looking at the form, looking at where he is now, look at what he's got in previous seasons. Is he going to be good for the rest of the season? And this is one of the things, by looking at the different data, it does sort of like come to life. Now, just a couple of other charts I'll show you. The return on investment, this is a work in progress. Basically, this is a live report, live as in every 15 minutes. Completed means it's shown completed because it's the end of the season. But what would generally happen is if you run this for a game week, it will tell you which players are completed and which players have still got their game to play, gives you their XG value. Value will be live, as in what the value is now, the points they've got, but you've got E points, which is event points. So if I just click on that, I think I've got to click on it twice. Oh no, so we can actually see that because this was the final game, like Harry Kane got 16 points. And these are what I'm working on now. So these are work in progress. So ROI is return on investment. So this is basically saying if you buy him, the higher the number, the better. There you go. Look, you got Granit Xhaka there at 3.19 because he's not that expensive, but he's getting some good points. So this is what I'm trying to do, is come out of an algorithm that basically says, should you buy him? If he's got a low number, no. If he's got a high number, yes. Points per game and points per minute. So again, this is why sort of like the points per game with points per minute will be much better with Haaland, not because he got more points, but he played less to get those points. And this is again when you're analysing the data. Kane almost got the same amount. He got 6 goals less, but he was very close on points. But when you look at it, Haaland played less in games and minutes. And then just the player history. Now, this is one of those. Again, this is like a work in progress. If I just pick on, I'll pick on Liverpool, and then I'd go midfield. And then guess who I'm going to pick? He says, it's all right, still trying to do. Salah. What this will tell me is so I've been collecting data for 6 seasons. This tells me how many points he scored against those teams in each season. So again, what I'm trying to do is, like against Newcastle, he's almost got double points in every season. So again, what this does is this gives me an indicator. When I'm looking at the fixtures, I'm looking at the form, I can look at this and hopefully it gives me who I should pick. So that's how I've been using Power BI. So again, all my data is in a data model. I use small amounts of DAX, but most of the work has been done in the data model itself. Right, so if I get rid of that and then go back to the presentation, and then does it work is the big question. This is my my life in FPL. So from 2006 up to last season, this is the how in the top percentages I finished in. So when I started, I was in the top just 14%. Next season, I was in the top 1.5%. What you have to remember is the numbers going up exponentially as in managers. So the numbers down here are almost meaningless because I'm playing against less managers. I'm not sure what. Oh, 2008. Why did I do so bad? Right now, this is I was getting divorced in 2008, so I spent less time on FPL, and that's why I had a terrible year. And then it's sort of like in subsequent years when I finally got divorced, I started doing well. Now, if we go to the last 6 years when I've been using the data against all of these, there's definitely more of a consistency. Now, the last 3 seasons, I finished up the difference between my points in the last 3 seasons has been 100. So from 2021 season was the most I got, and I got something like 2,460. The following year, I literally got 6 points less, and I dropped to the top 2%. This year, I was about 100 points less, and I got 17.5. So in this year, I was in the top 20,000 of all the FPL managers worldwide. This year, I can't remember what. This year, I can't remember what it was. This year it was 800,000. So does it work? Yes. Looking at the data has given me a consistent point score, and the problem is everyone else is getting better. So what I need to do now is actually look at how I'm using the data, and that was a prime example with the Salah between those 2 game weeks on why I didn't look at the data. So it's one of those that if I would have just added a couple more data points in, it would have been better for me. So I'm quite happy. Yes, it does work. Yes, it's a lot of work to actually get it to a point where I can just run stuff and it shows me it. And then where are we going with this? So my plan, have something like the auto select. So I got a Power BI report where basically I just say, who should I pick at the start of the season? And then it picks who I should have. So I was speaking to someone today and they were saying that's almost like having a chat GBT to pick your team. But it's one of those, I've done a lot of work on this data. So if the data picks the team for me, I'm going to be quite happy with that. I have done SMS in the past where we've sent out, I've had user groups where I've used my data to actually send out who the top 5 transfers are. And this is one which I'm still working on. So this is actually a Power BI dashboard whereby I'm using, in this particular one, I was using R, I'm changing it to Python, where I predict what points they're going to get in the next few game weeks. So it's one of those, I've been working on this for a long time. Hopefully I will get it somewhere, but predicting points is extremely hard because there's so many variables to take into account. So it's in a good place now. It works. I use it a lot. I do give stats to people when they want them, and sort of like just so they can use it. And I'm a massive advocate for sort of like people getting involved in FPL, especially if you're a data person, because there's so many data points in FPL that you can use. And I've built this entire project over the last. I started off as a prediction league, a prediction website, and now it's this FPL. So I've been building this for over 15 years, and in its latest disguise, it's Python, SQL Server, and Power BI. And it's a great way of learning new technologies and also understanding data more. So that concludes my talk on analyzing data of FPL and some of the things that I do with it. I hope you found it interesting. I know football's not everyone's cup of tea, but I'm just trying to get it out there that actually FPL is more data related than football related. In fact, if you're good with data and you don't know football, I would definitely join a work mini league so you can actually show how your skills are better at picking people because you won't have emotions in it. So thank you very much.
Jamie, thank you very much for that. I have to say, I suspected you were a Liverpool fan when I saw Mr. Klopp there behind you.
Yeah, I got life-size Jurgen Klopp behind me. Yeah.
Right. I'd like to open up the questions, if I may. You told us about artificial intelligence and how you're taking things that way. Have you tried to look at something like key influencers in Power BI to see what factors influence a player's score?
Yeah, I did. I think it was last season. I actually did use the key influencers to see what it came up with, but I just couldn't get it to work quite right. But again, it's one of those that it was quite interesting to see what it was coming up with, and it did pick out some key stuff to say, you know, who were the key players, what were the key events. When it was looking at the transfer data, it was sort of like it would be able to tell me stuff based on that. So I have looked at it. I couldn't get it to work right, but it's something I will go back to.
Thank you. Any questions? Anyone else?
Yeah, I've got a question. It sounds like it's in the background. It's probably like a model that's calculating all the odds, and it's probably a logistic regression model. So it's taking a category that's assigning statistic, and then it's using to predict the future. So if you take that approach, it probably has to use the last 6 games or the last 10 games to model those future values. So you use that as your base when you start your first, second, third, fourth game, because that's to get the data somewhere. So I think that's how it's works. Yeah, so someone like that. Yeah. But I think that, and then the other thing is, if it is a model, the next thing is what weighting is a different category is getting, and then if you can almost work it backwards, you know, this category might give me a higher score compared to this category. You can create a page where you've got your key indicators, and then you can drill down. But I think, you know, I think it's just a statistical model, and maybe each match is being evaluated one set at a time. But it's just an idea.
Because it was
like NHS on it and stuff.
Yeah, because it's quite interesting.
Okay.
Yeah, because it was quite interesting when you said about the 6 games. With like the format, I chose the 4 games because I found that the 6 games wasn't quite right, and so for the last couple of years I just been using the 4 games as a rolling 4 games to help me, and that seems to work right. With the prediction model, when this started, it was more for predicting football results. I did come up with an algorithm where I would look at lots of things that was happening when 2 teams were playing. So it would be like their home form, their away form, their home goal difference against the away goal difference. Bringing in the football, the FPL data, I was able to look at how many points the defense was getting against the attack, and then when I was doing that, it was giving me sort of like a number to give me a probability that this would be the outcome. So it's one of those areas I need to do more on it because it's really, really interesting.
So put another way, if you have like one view and you know there's these 6 indicators, so you can tell at a glance with Salah, you know, if I'm looking against Bournemouth, it's I will look. So I actually think it's the opposite view. It's like you want to pivot one match by multiple rows, where each row might be an indicator of the final results. If I had to guess on instinct, and that would drive the analysis. But I might be wrong, obviously. But so at a glance, you want to say, okay, this match is coming up. See the statistics if it was pivoted, and you've got your 6 or 8 variables for that match right in front of you. You know what I mean?
Yeah. It was. Yeah, I used that United Bournemouth pairing because it was one of those where I got it 100% wrong. I couldn't have got it any wronger, and so that's a good example of why I didn't use the data. I didn't have the views that I needed. So you are right. It's sort of like building that up. So at a glance, you can actually see which way you should go. And I think that's the next iteration of this, is to actually have more piece of information about something so that you can make more of an informed decision.
Thank you.
Test. Can everyone hear? Yeah, that's it. Thanks, Jim. It was a really interesting talk. I actually come from sports analytics, so it was a really interesting talk for me. It gets me back in my ballpark a little bit. Curious about the Salah Haaland decision. It sounds like there's probably some learnings there for you. I wonder if you could maybe summarize any changes that you've taken in your approach that you might take into the future to make sure that something like that doesn't happen again.
It was the Salah Haaland. It was one of those where it was almost like when you're watching something in slow motion and you know it's going to happen, but you don't do anything to avoid it. It was heart over head with Salah, as is many of the times when I keep choosing Salah. With the Haaland decision, I had many discussions with many people about it, and what really annoyed me was the fact that I said if he gets 1 goal, he gets more. So it was one of those, whenever he got 1, I always knew it was going to be a terrible decision because he was going to get more, and he proved me right. So it's one of those where in my head, I knew he was the right decision, but for some unknown reason, I sort of was biased towards, yeah, but the Premiership's really hard, so I don't think he's going to do as good as what he can. Now, the problem when you build your team at the beginning is you get one free transfer a week. So to change him, I would have had to take more hits because you could do multiple transfers, but you take a 4-point hit. So I think it was a case. And in the very first game, Salah did do well. But then it was after that, he dipped slightly and Haaland really took off. And it was one of those that I would sort of like, I would listen to myself more from a head perspective than a heart perspective, because I knew Haaland was going to do well, but I just convinced myself that he wouldn't, and it was the bias of the Premiership is difficult. And when you look at sort of like so many players that have come in and they've taken a season to get going, whereas Haaland hasn't, he's hit the ground running. So for me, it would be a case of, you know, it's when I realise I've made that mistake, correct it as early as possible, because that really scuppered any plans of winning any leagues this season, because I just did I didn't, once I realized it was a big mistake, I didn't correct that mistake, and then I just tried to, it's a bit like a gambler chasing his losses. It took me many sort of like months to actually start gaining on people. So the Haaland Salah decision was, I should have looked at the sort of the previous stats about who he played for. Wish I did, but I just didn't trust them.
Interesting. Thank you. Cheers.
Hi, Jamie. It was an interesting presentation. Something I did previously was I worked with Leicester Tigers. This was with, when I was working at Coral, the bookies. And what we did is the amount of data that you've got, if you as you're modelling it on kind of club form, I used that and went to kind of Leicester Tigers, the rugby team, to say actually you can model your ticket pricing strategy based on this information. So, like you mentioned about the weather that you're collecting, or time of year, or who you're playing against, or the top of the Premier League or bottom, what players have you bought in, all that kind of data. I built a regression model and said, actually, you can charge a bit more for these tickets, but actually undercut these tickets to get more people in, because it's probably going to be a bad result. And then it kind of supported them and they made more revenue at the back of it. So I think there's a lot of application for the data that you've got, because you're collecting so much. A lot commercially.
Yeah, I think having a background as a data engineer, I know how to get the data, I know how to model the data, I know how to sort of like do lots of different things with the data. But where I'm not a data scientist, I think a lot of it is the machine learning and all stuff like that is my weak point, and that's what I need to understand more, so that when I'm looking at the data, I understand which models to actually use to get the most out of the data. And this is why I'm saying that when I first started using Power BI, I had lots of different reports. Then I sort of like amalgamated some, and I'm playing with Python and R to try and actually see how I can use a model to actually give me predicted results based on the previous results. And like the previous person, when they were saying about the 4 or 6 game weeks, I tried doing it by looking at sort of like 8 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks, just to see what I could do. But I just couldn't get it quite in the position that it would give me anything that was meaningful. But you are right, it is a case of, with all this data, if I can find the right model for it, then I can definitely use it to make me a better fantasy football player.
Questions?
Hi, Jamie, it's Santop here. I just wanted to find out about how you got the data, the APIs you used, and if they were costing anything, if they were free, or you actually pay for any of it.
So I came across the APIs because it's always getting the data is the hard part. Now I just did some sort of like, well, I'm sort of like parts of different user groups. I just came across some articles, and they were actually data science articles on using fantasy football data, and I came across the APIs there. And the APIs are readily available to use. They're free, but the Premier League, who own the fantasy football, they will sometimes remove data without telling you, and they do change the name of the API every so many years. So what generally happens is you get your, so I just got some Python some Python scripts running, which goes up and gets the data. But it's like I have to check at the start of each season to make sure they haven't changed the names. But they do them. The APIs are for different things. So you've got the non-aggregated data, the aggregated data, there's mini leagues, and so basically I just pull down as much of the data as I can, just to see how good it is. And what they will sometimes do is throughout the season they may add data. So this season, just before Christmas, they added in XA and XG, which was the expected assists and expected goals. So again, I just added that data in, so I didn't have a full season of data for it. You're forever evolving however it is you're extracting the data from the APIs, but the APIs are readily available and they don't cost anything. All the data that I use, because I don't use it commercially, is I sort of like just using sort of like the free versions. If there is rich sources of data, but there's quite a few of them which you have to pay. You could use Opta, who are the main people for doing all data to do with pretty much every sport there is. You could pay for APIs from them, but they are extremely expensive because they're under a commercial license. But luckily, the API ones are free.
I've got data. I think I use something like football.co.data.co.uk. That's free data for just the Premier League going back to the start of the Premier League '92.
Yes.
England, Scotland, Wales. Sorry, not Wales. England, Scotland, and I'm expanded that over the European clubs, so France, Germany, Portugal, Italy. Now I think I've even added Argentina and MLS in there.
Yep.
So all that's free. So
yeah, that when on that very first dashboard I was showing you, and I was saying the win loss percentage, that's based on data from the football.co.uk website.
Okay,
So,
thanks very much.
Yeah, no, but that is a really good site. It's a really useful site as well.
Yeah. All right, everyone. So just to leave it there. Thank you, Jamie, again ever so much. We hope to see you soon in Birmingham for an in-person event.
Yes, definitely.
Everyone in the room, feel free to continue networking outside. I'm not sure Richard is still in the beverages outside. Yeah, so feel free to network and make sure to sign up for the next.
Well, I think another round of applause for Jamie and both the guys. Thanks so much. Jamie, thanks so much, mate. And I'll probably give you a call tomorrow just to catch up.
Yeah, please do. Okay, thanks for having me. Bye for now.
Thanks, mate. See you later.